Hello, my name is Miriam and I'm a researcher at the University of Klagenfurt.
Hey, my name is Philip and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Kassel.
And today we will look behind the myth.
Will AI end discrimination once and for all?
First, we will show you why AI is perceived to be more fair than humans.
Why we think this perspective is problematic.
And what we can do about this problem.
Let's first state that AI enters the playing field of making decisions that affect people. So a lot of people might think that this way, discriminative decision-making could be ended. Why? Because as we all know, and also the thinker on the slide assumes, human beings are far from perfect, right? So instead, they have emotions, they are moody, they can easily be persuaded, deceived, charmed, or even manipulated. And also they are sometimes just wrong and make unfair decisions. And technology rather, so as the story goes, is based on cold calculations. And as such, AI is often perceived to be discrimination blind, meaning that it does not judge people by their status and in fact does not see gender or race or class and so on. We don't want to go into deep detail of the tech stuff going on inside the AI, but let's just imagine that in AI decision-making, people are encoded as allegedly objective data of personal information in the system. And a fair AI could, in theory, be instructed to treat all equal people or equal groups equally. So decisions like who gets the job based on AI recruiting systems could then be made fairer than human decision-making as a result of objective and correct mathematical calculations going on inside the AI. So, of course, hard-coded rules like women are inferior to men on the job market are commonly not an explicit statement in the code, but we maybe would tell the same about a sexist manager, for example. So if prejudices are not explicitly encoded in the AI and human beings can be discriminatory, then Philip, what is the problem at all? Is the myth true? Can AI end discrimination?
Thanks, Miriam, for raising this interesting question. To answer this question, let's first look into the associations that easily come up in the context of AI and technology in general. As you can see on the slide, we have listed several attributes that are linked to what can be called an objective perspective on technology and in general and in AI in particular. AI is supposed to be unbiased, unemotional, mathematical, correct, independent, autonomous, and so on. Maybe most important in this context is the perspective that AI is a neutral tool that can be used either way, for good and for bad. A popular example, Bodo Rosenhan, professor of computer science at the Leibniz University Hanover, says, quote, "Artificial intelligence is like a knife. You can hurt yourself with it, but also do a lot of useful things with it, like cutting vegetables." Quote end. So the main argument is that it is mainly dependent on the user, or for that matter, creator or programmers of the respective algorithm or AI. So wait, if AI and the knife seem to be difficult things to compare at first, right? It only makes sense if technology is perceived as just a tool and AI is also just a tool. Another aspect which adds to this is that AI as a technology is ascribed a certain autonomy. As such, it is less perceived as a tool controlled by a human actors directly, but is more like an independent agent. Thus, there might be the additional hopes associated with AI if disentangled from the hands of faulty humans, which Miriam stated before. So these hopes express themselves in the myth that AI may end discrimination. So is technology and AI just a neutral tool floating around unimpressed by the conditions that created it? And does discrimination only enter the world due to decisions of individuals? Is AI maybe the perfect tool to overcome discriminations? We say no. The tool metaphor is powerful because it is so prevalent in society's discourse around technology and AI. But as science and technology scholars have pointed out, all technology is socially constructed. And secondly, critical feminist scholars, for example, have pointed out technology, and especially AI for that matter, is entangled in structural power hierarchies traversing society. So we say the tool metaphor is dangerous because it is both a simplification and apolitical. So before we look at the socio-technical dimensions of AI, let's first look at the term AI. So what is AI? AI algorithms, algorithmic decision-making systems, are often used synonymously. In a scientific sense, AI does not describe a thing, but rather a scientific field of research focused around, among other topics, machine learning. But AI today is used in all kinds of contexts where algorithms are aiding or sometimes even replacing human decision-making. Sometimes the technology behind it may be just statistical data processing and not state-of-the-art machine learning. So AI as a term is widely used in any context where algorithms act without full human oversight. We focus on data-driven, semi-automatic algorithmic decision-making systems here. The following examples fall into this category. The technology behind it may technically not count as AI or machine learning. Let's get back to our myth. Will AI end discrimination? On this slide, we can see several reports about AI or algorithmic decision-making systems gone wrong. They were supposed to or expected to decide discrimination-free, but the reality is rather the opposite. It even perpetuates structural discriminations in sometimes even grotesque ways. For example, Amazon established an AI platform or software to choose job applicants for applications dialogues. It turns out the algorithm prefers male job applicants and was biased against women. Another example. According to a ProPublica report on a score which determines whether people during pre-trial are likely to re-offend, the algorithm is biased against Black people. According to their report, the algorithm developed by a private company scores Black people more likely to re-offend during pre-trial and are thus more likely to be incarcerated, even if they have not been found guilty. Another example comes from Austria. The AMS, the Arbeitsmarktservice of Austria, developed an algorithm to calculate the score or likelihood of being reintegrated into the job market. And linked to this is the support for job seekers. It turns out the algorithm is biased against women. And to also turn to another example, which sheds a light on the intransparency of AI. Anna Biselli's report about the so-called speech biometric assistance system of the German Federal Office for Migration and Refugees. It turns out it is totally unclear how the algorithm works, but there's way less public debate around this kind of algorithm because people affected are asylum seekers, which do not have great means of making their voice heard. But still, this algorithm is a reality in the lives of many people. So, Miriam, what do you say?
So I would say that maybe our thinker here on the slide is now a bit confused of what you said, because he has just learned that AI in the wild, how some would call it, meaning that outside of a laboratory environment, is discriminatory and sometimes even worse because of its systematic and subtle errors. So all these examples which Philip has just mentioned show AI is supposed to decide mathematically in certain contexts and is supposed to optimize procedures to make processes in private or public institutions more efficient. But in all these examples, the weaknesses of this optimization became visible and apparent. So now the question is, where does this rather big gap between aspiration and reality in the context of AI come from? So why is it that technology associated with big hopes of overcoming human error fails so distinctively? So as we will show next, there are several quite complex reasons to it. And we claim that there's also the urgent need not to look only to the AI itself to unravel these reasons, like we will do, but also to look and understand the socio-technical entanglements or embeddedness of AI. So we have derived our ideas presented based on the books, which you can see on the right photo on the slide. And yeah, we just suggest to check them out in case you're further interested.
So we now want to focus on the concrete realities in which structural connections between AI and society reveal themselves. How do structural inequalities, fundamental beliefs, social bias, histories of oppression, and so on find their way into AI? These connections express themselves in multiple ways, as you can see on the slide. We will only touch upon some of these and only briefly. Check out our resource collection for more details. So first, let's turn to data and models. Most successful modern AI approaches rely on the availability of big data, so-called training data. For example, to detect faces in images, training data is a big amount of faces taken somewhere from the internet. After learning, so-called learning, it is supposed to detect faces in images, for example, from a surveillance camera stream or from your holiday pictures. The result is to detect areas in an image where faces are seen. On a side note, again, there's misleading terminology going on here. It does not really learn like humans do, although the term learn might raise this association. Luckily, humans don't need to see 1 million faces to be able to perceive faces or hear the same words spoken by thousands of people to understand any word. So what are the problems regarding this data? So there's, for example, representation bias. Some data sets simply lack diversity. As Joy Boom-Navini's intersectional study called Gender Shades revealed, many face recognition and classifications algorithms were biased against Black women, meaning they are able to detect white men very good and white women also pretty good, but Black women are very poorly detected. So this leads also to data availability. Which data is available at all? For what purposes and in which context? From which areas of the world? Concerning which kind of people? Another aspect is so-called data fundamentalism, a term by Kate Crawford. So there's a hidden truth. There's the belief in many AI research that there's some kind of hidden truth in data, invisible to humans, but visible to the AI, because it can kind of look very deeply into, for example, images and detect patterns that escape the human eye. But this is a dangerous belief, because AI in theory can be used on all kinds of data to find all kinds of patterns. And in fact, it is often used on all kinds of data, independent of scientific value or accuracy. There are many examples of how AI can even get us back to the dark ages of sorting people into categories based on their faces. For example, the company Faceception claims to be able to detect whether someone is a terrorist alone from images of their faces. So these two examples just show that many AI researchers or companies have an interest of finding patterns in data which are scientifically very questionable. Let's turn maybe to AI practitioners and research teams.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, if you're an AI practitioner yourself, this might be new to you, but social science and feminist theory and so on has shown that researchers and practitioners are always embedded into social structures, and as such, they produce these structures as well. So society might shape the way in which an AI practitioner sees the world. Maybe to give you an example, an AI practitioner might perceive a certain truth to be fair and objective, like the belief Philip mentioned before, that a large enough number of data is enough to classify all people into categories like criminal or non-criminal, or categories like straight and non-straight, and instructs an AI to decide how to treat individuals based on that ground truth. But in fact, this alleged truth shows only that his knowledge is based on certain underlying assumptions, which might be also unconscious, which might turn out to be racist or sexist and just discriminatory. That's not only that what is perceived as true is dependent on the knower, like the AI practitioner, but also on how the knower is situated in the world. So as a lot of AI practitioners are white men and they have a certain educational background, their specific situating in the world shapes the way which challenges this AI practitioner might perceive as a problem, and which solutions he might develop to this problem. So here it is important to acknowledge that privileged person, like our AI practitioner, might see other problems and might have another perception of discrimination than the persons affected by discrimination.
There's also the issue of business models and private companies, as you see on the slides. Today, there are numerous reports about how AI goes wrong or already went wrong. Does this halt the development of AI or interrupt it until all these problems are solved and we only have fair AI in the realm of our socio-technical life? No. The reality is that even if a tool is harmful, it may very well still be used due to profit motives or rationality centered mainly around issues like efficiency. If private companies or public institutions see AI as something that makes their processes more efficient, there's a strong interest in using this kind of technology. And additionally, the neutrality story of AI that I mentioned already before serves as a kind of an additional argument in raising acceptance for this kind of technologies in the public. As Safia Umoja Noble in her book Algorithms of Oppression pointed out, in the context of racist and sexist results of a search engine, she says that sexist and racist search results computed by high-tech algorithms come from a, quote, corporate logic of either willful neglect or a profit imperative that makes money from racism and sexism, end quote.
So, we also have science and society and history coming into our socio-technical field. And so it's almost the same like we said about the AI practitioners and researchers. Also, science and scientific knowledge production is not neutral. So instead, it's deeply rooted into patriarchal, racist, and colonial history. Maybe to give you an example, science and their institutional emergences, like universities, were deeply involved into the invention of the concept of race and their differences to justify slave trade and colonization. And we could give you more examples, like how science was deeply involved into and profited from the Nazi regime in Germany. But there are also more subtle colonial legacies in science, like the basic question, what is perceived to be science and what is not perceived to be science. And also, of course, for a long time, women were structurally excluded to enter scientific institutions or to gain scientific knowledge and so on. So what we want to say here is that as AI technology is shaped by the ongoing discourse of mostly so-called hard science like computer science and engineering, AI often perpetuates dominant scientific approaches and structures, which are perceived to be neutral and objective, but in fact are not. Yeah, and digging deeper into why and how society and history shape the world, and therefore also AI, might maybe take us some hours and might also be out of our expertise. But just let us state for now that, of course, society and history, or to put it in other terms, a certain social, historic, specific way, also shape which AI is developed and which AI is not developed. Like to give you an example, the development of new AI to secure the European borders, but there's no AI helping refugees in distress at sea to navigate to a safe harbor. So here it is important to acknowledge, like we already mentioned, that we just live in a world that is not just, and discrimination is also perpetuated in and by the AI. Philip.
So in the previous section, we looked at several aspects, why and how AI is connected with society, including structures of hierarchy and oppression. We argued that computer technology and AI are, like our matter, not separable from the political, social, economical, and other conditions of our realities. Discriminations will not be ended by AI. On the contrary, if we look at AI for fixing our social problems, we may even worsen the situation. And there's a danger that AI encodes all kinds of social inequalities in its workings, and in this way preserves the unjust status quo. It can serve as a kind of neutralizing lens, making structures of oppression invisible due to its neutrality. Due to debate on technology and its mathematical objective aura, it is difficult to challenge decisions made by it, especially by people directly affected by algorithmic decision-making, who are not in the position to appeal AI decisions or even know that they are judged by an AI. Thus, we cannot look at AI to solve our discrimination problem. Sociologist and professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, Ruha Benjamin says, as you can see on the slide, quote, "I argue that tech fixes often hide, speed up, and even deepen discrimination, while appearing to be neutral or benevolent when compared to the racism of a previous era. This set of practices that I call the New Jim Code encompasses a range of discriminatory designs, some that explicitly work to amplify hierarchies, many that ignore and thus replicate social divisions, and a number that aim to fix racial bias, but end up doing the opposite," end quote. But there's also a chance. Lots of critical scholars, especially from critical race, post-colonial studies, and feminist sciences, as well as activists, work together to dismantle the alleged objectiveness of AI and all kinds of related myths. In a certain way, AI can, as we do now, serve as a proxy to debate deeply rooted societal inequalities. There are ever more testimonies surface that prove encoded inequalities in the technology. It is time to decode them.
So we have almost reached the end of our presentation, but finally, we want to say a few more words about what discrimination is and what is it not, in our opinion. So because we have noticed that in AI research, discrimination is often perceived as the opposite of fairness or statistical fairness. But yes, discrimination is no irrational mistake of individuals, nor is it only driven by individuals' decisions. So instead of talking about individual discrimination in AI, we would encourage AI researchers and practitioners and also ourselves to think about discrimination as a structural and systematic phenomena. So there are different structural modes of discriminations like classism, racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and so on. And it is just not possible to change all these modes of structural discrimination just by choice. And as such, neither can other social actors or artifacts or whatever you would call it, like AI. So we have to understand AI from an intersectional socio-technical perspective, meaning while it may be possible to define fairness metrics that allow for a fairer treatment of individuals or groups by AI, it is still embedded into wider social structures of discrimination and oppression, and also does not imply that a certain treatment is just. So AI is no neutral tool, but with demystifying the socio-technical perspective, we think that it's still possible to use it, but maybe in a less hyped and a more reflexive way. What can science and AI practitioners do about that, Philip?
So I think it's important, as you already said, to realize the socio-technical embedding we have seen before. It is important to talk about democratization of AI technology. It is important to include all kinds of stakeholders, and especially those that are affected by the AI. This means, for example, in design, to apply participatory and inclusive design measures, to include people who are really affected or may be affected in the design process, like how is the AI technology planned, how it is developed, and then how it is applied. It is important to also talk about public ownership of data and digital infrastructures. As we have seen before, the profit motive is a strong reason why a lot of racist and sexist technology is still applied today. It's important to support open sciences, to support transparent and comprehensible science and publications about AI. And it's also very important to be self-reflective on your situation in the world, who you are, what's your position, how you are connected to the world around you.
So we would say, let's educate ourselves and enhance our digital literacy, like you might be doing right now, watching this video. Also support algorithmic watchdogs like Algorithm Watch or Epicenter Works in Austria. And of course, have a debate with your friends and your family or your colleagues around the areas in which you think AI should be deployed and in which areas it should not be deployed. And we just want to end with our claim that there is no technical fix for discrimination, and that we should fight or at least support fights against discrimination in all parts of society. Yes, thank you. And if you have further questions, just reach out to us, Philip at the University of Kassel and myself at the University of Klagenfurt. Thank you.